The cart wheels ground to a stop at the edge of the inn's crooked wooden fence. Amelia clutched the frayed shawl around her shoulders, her eyes wide and glassy from the cold wind clawing at her face. Her father didn't come to say goodbye. His debt collector simply handed her off, his voice a sharp echo. Paid in full! The inn loomed ahead, nestled against the side of the mountain like a sleeping beast. The roof sagged under heavy moss, and its narrow windows glowed dimly, as if each flickering light inside fought to stay alive. The door creaked open. A tall man in a dark wool coat stepped onto the porch, his pale face unreadable. He motioned for her to come forward, turning before she could speak. Her legs felt numb as she stepped off the cart, her shoes sinking into the damp mud. The driver turned the horse and disappeared down the path without looking back. Inside, the smell of damp wood and boiled herbs wrapped around her like a shroud. She followed the innkeeper through the main hall, her fingers brushing the rough, stained walls. He stopped near a narrow staircase and turned. "You obey. No letters, no visitors. You do not cross the gate," he said, each word clipped and final. Amelia swallowed, nodding even as her heart pounded wildly in her throat. The innkeeper's gaze lingered on her face for a moment before he turned again, disappearing into a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Amelia stood alone at the base of the stairs, her bundle pressed tight against her chest. Outside, the last echo of the departing cart faded into the mist. She closed her eyes and drew in a shaky breath, the walls of the inn already closing in around her like a trap. Amelia stood at the base of the staircase, the last echo of the cartwheels fading into the fog outside. Her fingers tightened around her thin shawl, her body shivering not just from the cold, but from the sudden hollowness in her chest. The innkeeper returned, his heavy boots thudding along the warped wooden floor. In his hands he held a small oil lamp, the flame casting sharp lines across his gaunt face. "Follow me," he ordered. His voice was low and flat, as though he were reciting something he had said 100 times before. Amelia climbed the stairs behind him, each step creaking under her weight. At the top, a narrow hallway branched off into 3 darkened rooms. The innkeeper pushed open the nearest door and stepped aside. "This is yours," he said. Inside, a narrow bed with a rough wool blanket stood against the wall. A chipped basin sat beneath a tiny barred window, and a small wooden chest waited at the foot of the bed. The air smelled of damp linen and ash. Amelia stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning every corner as if expecting to find something lurking in the shadows. "No letters," the innkeeper continued from the doorway. "No visitors, no stepping beyond the gate. You speak only when spoken to. You work when told." She turned toward him, her lips parting, but no sound came. His pale eyes locked on hers, and whatever words had formed in her throat withered before they could escape. After a long, silent stare, he closed the door without another word. The latch clicked into place on the other side, sealing her in. Amelia stood motionless in the center of the room. The weight of his rules settled over her like a heavy wool coat, suffocating and scratchy against her skin. She lowered her bundle onto the bed and sat beside it, her hands trembling in her lap. Beyond the tiny window, fog pressed against the glass, as if trying to find its way inside. In that moment, she felt the last thread tying her to her old life snap, and the dark quiet of the inn swallowed her completely. The first morning in the inn felt endless. Amelia woke to the muffled clatter of pots and low voices below, her body stiff from the lumpy mattress. For a few moments she lay still, trying to remember where she was, but the smell of damp wood and boiled herbs pulled her sharply back to reality. She rose and pulled her shawl around her shoulders, stepping out into the narrow hallway. The boards creaked under her feet, each sound echoing as if announcing her every move. Downstairs she found a small kitchen dimly lit by a single oil lamp. A young woman stood near the hearth, stirring a large pot. Her hair was tied tightly under a worn scarf, and her shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to fold herself into the smallest possible shape. Amelia opened her mouth to speak, but the girl's eyes flicked toward her, wide and dark with fear, then darted away just as quickly. In the corner, an old gardener crouched over a crate of wilted herbs, his back bent like a bow. His weathered hands moved slowly, sorting leaves with careful precision. When Amelia took a tentative step toward him, he didn't look up. The innkeeper appeared in the doorway. His eyes swept across the room, pausing on Amelia. "You will help her in the kitchen," he said, gesturing toward the silent girl. "You will serve guests when told. You will not speak unless asked." Amelia nodded, her voice buried somewhere deep in her chest. The girl handed her a small knife without a word, her fingers cold and quick. Together they worked in silence, slicing vegetables and cleaning muddy roots. Occasionally Amelia glanced at the girl, searching for some trace of warmth, but found only a tight jaw and hollow stare. The gardener shuffled past them, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he passed close, Amelia caught the faint scent of earth and old smoke. He paused for the briefest second, his lips parting as if to say something, but then he turned away, disappearing out the back door into the fog. The kitchen filled with the thick, heavy smell of broth. The air felt tight, as if the walls themselves were listening. Amelia lowered her head and kept her hands moving. Every slice of the knife felt like a quiet heartbeat, each cut another small surrender to the silence pressing in around her. Days slid past in a heavy, unbroken blur. Amelia moved from the kitchen to the guest hall and back again, her hands always busy, her eyes always low. Each morning began before dawn with the scraping of the innkeeper's boots outside her door, and each night ended with her lying rigid in the narrow bed, the dark pressing in like a second blanket. It was during one of these quiet, endless mornings that she began to notice the details the others pretended not to see. While sweeping the hallway outside the guest rooms, Amelia spotted a heavy iron lock bolted onto a door at the far end. She paused, her broom resting against her hip. The door looked older than the rest, its wood darkened and scarred, as if it had once tried to resist being closed. She stepped closer, her breath catching. Deep grooves ran along the floor in front of it, marks that looked like they had been scratched there by desperate hands. She shivered and turned quickly back to her work, heart pounding in her throat. In the backyard, beyond the vegetable beds and the crooked tool shed, she noticed a small mound of earth marked with a single leaning wooden stake. The stake bore no name, only a rough, crude cross carved into its surface. She stared at it each time she carried peelings out to the compost heap. The ground around it seemed untouched by footsteps, as if the others carefully avoided even looking at it. Once she saw the gardener standing near it at dawn, his hat clutched in both hands, his head bowed low. When he noticed her watching from the kitchen window, he turned abruptly and vanished into the fog without a word. That evening, while gathering clean linens from a narrow storage room, Amelia found herself lingering near a small window that faced the back garden. Moonlight spilled over the silent mound, turning the crude cross into a pale slash in the dark. A sudden creak behind her snapped her back. She turned to see the housemaid standing in the doorway, her face ghostly in the low lamplight. Their eyes met. A flicker of something, fear or warning, passed between them. But the maid said nothing. She only backed away slowly, closing the door without a sound. Amelia pressed her palm to the cold window pane, her fingers trembling. There were secrets buried here, she realized. Secrets no one dared speak aloud. And in that moment, she knew the inn was not simply a prison of walls and rules. It was a place that swallowed voices and left only silent shadows behind. Late one night, long after the inn had fallen into its restless hush, Amelia sat hunched over a small wooden table in her room. The moonlight slipped through the narrow bars of her window, painting pale stripes across the rough floorboards. Her hands shook as she held a scrap of old parchment, stolen from a pile in the storage room, and a dull pencil she had hidden beneath her blanket. She pressed the pencil down, the words scratching out in broken, uneven lines. "I am alive, please, someone come. I don't know how long I can stay, Father, please." Her tears smudged the last lines, soaking the parchment as she folded it carefully, her breath snagging in her throat. She tucked the note into the sleeve of her dress, resolving to slip it into the gardener's herb basket at dawn. But before she could move, a sharp creak split the air behind her. She spun around, the note still clutched in her fist. The innkeeper stood in the doorway, his face half lit by the lantern in his hand. His eyes fell to her fist, the crumpled note peeking from her fingers like a caught breath. He stepped forward, each footstep deliberate and slow. Amelia backed away until she hit the wall, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. He snatched the note from her hand. opening it with a flick of his wrist. As he read, his thin lips curled into something like a smile, though his eyes remained cold and empty. Without a word, he stepped to the small stove in the corner of the room. He lit a match and set the edge of the paper aflame. Amelia lunged forward, but he shoved her back with a single brutal movement. She fell hard against the bed frame, pain exploding across her shoulder. The parchment curled and blackened in his hand, the ash drifting slowly to the floor like dead moths. He turned to her, the burnt remains falling from his fingers. "No letters," he said, his voice low and steady as though explaining a simple household rule. He took one step closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. "No hope," he added softly. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Amelia slid to the floor, her hands covering her face. The smell of burned paper filled the room, stinging her nose and eyes. In the sudden, crushing silence, she realized she had not just lost a message. She had lost a fragile thread to the world beyond these walls. And in its place, a cold emptiness settled deep into her bones. The next morning, Amelia moved through her tasks as if her body belonged to someone else. Her arms chopped and scrubbed, her feet stepped and turned, but her mind spun in a tight, airless circle. The housemaid avoided her eyes entirely, her pale hands fluttering like startled birds whenever Amelia came too close. When Amelia stepped out to the garden to empty a bucket of scraps, she found the gardener kneeling by the herb beds, his back hunched and shaking. She paused, clutching the bucket to her chest, feeling the words pushing up her throat. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice small and rough. "Please, help me, there must be a way out." The gardener froze, his fingers curling into the dirt. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head, his lined face twisted with something between fear and pity. His voice came out as a whisper, thin as mist. "No one leaves alive, girl. This place, it keeps you." Amelia's eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. She opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head sharply, his eyes darting toward the inn. "She watches, always," he muttered, wiping his soiled hands on his apron. "Even the walls have ears." He staggered to his feet, turning away from her with trembling shoulders. As he moved toward the shed, he added in a hushed, broken voice, "Don't ask again. It's already too late for questions." Amelia stood frozen, the bucket slipping from her hands and spilling scraps across the dirt. Her breath shivered inside her chest, each inhale burning her throat. She turned and glanced back at the inn. The narrow windows looked down like watchful eyes, the thin curtains fluttering slightly as if someone had just stepped away. Her legs felt hollow as she bent to gather the fallen scraps. The gardener's words rang in her head, each one a nail driven deeper into her resolve. When she returned inside, she carried more than the bucket. She carried a new, gnawing certainty. No one here would save her. If she wanted to escape, she would have to do it alone. That night, long after the last guest's footsteps had faded and the innkeeper's lantern had vanished down the hall, Amelia lay wide awake in her narrow bed. Her mind replayed the gardener's words, each one echoing like a slow drumbeat. "No one leaves alive." She sat up slowly, her breath shallow. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, illuminating the splintered floorboards at the foot of her bed. Almost without thinking, she swung her legs over the edge and dropped to her knees. Her fingers slid over each plank, pressing and tapping, searching for any small give. Near the corner, one board felt slightly loose beneath her touch. Her heart thudded in her throat as she hooked her fingernails under its edge and pulled. The wood creaked sharply. She paused, frozen, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Silence. She pulled again, harder. The board shifted, then finally lifted, revealing a dark hollow beneath. She reached inside, her hands brushing against cold dirt and something softer, paper. Her fingers closed around it, and she drew out a thin, battered journal wrapped in a torn piece of linen. Amelia sank back on her heels, unwrapping the cloth with trembling hands. The journal's cover was cracked and stained, its edges frayed from years of hiding. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with hurried, uneven handwriting, desperate lines written in a trembling hand. "They watch at night. He takes letters and burns them. There is a trail beyond the grave. If you find this, do not wait." Amelia's eyes darted across the lines, each word a whisper from someone who had once stood exactly where she now knelt. The ink blurred in places, smudged by tears or shaking hands. She flipped further. On one page, a rough sketch, a narrow path winding away from the backyard grave and into the forest beyond. Her fingers gripped the pages so tightly they crumpled at the edges. Her breath came fast, sharp as the realization cracked through her fear. Someone else had planned to escape. Someone else had dared. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, rocking slightly as tears filled her eyes. In the quiet, Emilia felt a pulse of fierce, fragile resolve awaken inside her, a small trembling flame in the dark. She lowered the floorboard back into place and slipped into bed, clutching the journal under her blanket. Tonight, for the first time, her fear felt different. It felt like a beginning. The morning came in a heavy gray hush, the fog pressing so close against the inn windows that Emilia felt as if the world had been swallowed whole. She moved through her chores like a ghost, her fingers numb as she peeled vegetables and scrubbed pots. The housemaid's eyes flicked to her occasionally, but neither dared speak. After the midday meal, the innkeeper appeared in the kitchen doorway. His coat was buttoned high to his throat, and his thin mouth pressed into a hard line. "You will handle the guests alone," he ordered, his voice as flat as a hammer on iron. "No sleep tonight. No food until morning." Emilia's heart jolted. She swallowed hard and nodded, avoiding his gaze. The housemaid and gardener slipped away into the back rooms, leaving her alone in the kitchen. The hours blurred into a slow agony, preparing plates, serving at the long wooden table, cleaning spills, refilling mugs. The guests' eyes followed her in heavy silence, their gazes dark and expectant, like they were watching a performance they already knew the end of. As night fell, the inn filled with the smell of damp wool and strong ale. Her feet ached, her arms trembled each time she carried a tray. A low hum of conversation rumbled through the hall, but whenever she looked up, the guests fell quiet, their eyes boring into her with unspoken warning. Near midnight, she dropped a mug, the clay shattering across the floor. She bent to pick up the shards, her fingers slipping, fresh cuts blooming along her knuckles. The innkeeper stood by the doorway, his pale face unmoved. "Faster!" he snapped. She gathered the pieces, blood smearing across her palms and the floorboards. Each heartbeat rang in her ears like a drumbeat of punishment. By the time the guests filed to their rooms, the candles had burned low and the moon hung high beyond the fog. Emilia forced her stiff fingers to keep scrubbing the tables, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. She felt her mind slipping toward darkness, the edges of the room softening, but she held on, her thoughts looping over the journal hidden upstairs. "There is a trail beyond the grave, do not wait." When she finally stumbled back to her room, the first threads of dawn clawed at the sky. She collapsed onto her bed, her clothes still wet with sweat and blood. Her chest heaved, her fingers curled around invisible threads. Through the haze of exhaustion, one thought shone clear and sharp as a blade. Tomorrow she would act, or she would never have another chance. Emilia woke with a jolt, her muscles screaming from the night's endless work. Pale morning light seeped through the barred window, pooling on the floor like spilled milk. She rose shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her fingers found the hidden journal beneath the blanket, the pages already soft from her constant handling. She pressed it to her chest and listened. The hall outside was silent. Gathering her strength, she knelt by the bed and pried up the loose floorboard once more. This time, she took out the journal fully and unfolded the page with the rough sketch of the trail. Her eyes traced the line from the backyard grave, through a narrow break in the fence, and into the thick forest beyond. Her breath came faster. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and forced herself to memorize each curve of the path. She tucked the journal beneath her apron and stood, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs. She reached for a small bread knife she had hidden behind the basin, the only weapon she could find. Its edge was dull, but its weight felt solid in her trembling hand. The hallway remained empty as she slipped out of her room. Her feet carried her past the kitchen, where last night's smell of stale broth still lingered, and out to the back door. She stepped into the yard, the cold morning air slicing across her face. Her eyes darted to the small mound of earth marked with the rough wooden cross. A shiver shot down her spine. Beyond it she saw the low, crumbling fence and a narrow gap nearly hidden by overgrown weeds. The passage from the journal. "There is a trail beyond the grave," echoed in her skull, steady and insistent. Amelia moved forward, her breath tight and thin. Each step felt impossibly loud, the crunch of frost beneath her shoes echoing through the yard. She passed the grave, her fingers brushing the wooden cross as though in silent apology to whoever lay beneath. Reaching the fence, she dropped to her knees and pushed through the gap. Twigs snapped, cold mud smeared her apron, but she didn't stop. On the other side, a narrow, twisting trail opened before her, winding between the trees, half lost beneath layers of wet leaves and mist. She rose to her feet, her eyes wide with terror and hope. For the first time since her arrival, she felt the cold sting of the mountain air as something close to freedom, sharp, biting, and painfully alive. With one last glance back at the inn, Amelia turned and stepped onto the hidden path, her fingers clenching the knife, her pulse roaring in her ears. Amelia slipped between the trees, her breath coming in short, ragged pulls. The narrow trail twisted sharply, veiled by fog and tangled underbrush. She moved quickly but clumsily, her hands clutching the dull bread knife and the journal pressed to her ribs beneath her apron. Branches tore at her hair and scratched her arms. Each snap of a twig behind her sent a fresh jolt of panic through her chest. She didn't dare look back. Not yet. She replayed the gardener's warning in her head. "No one leaves alive." The words coiled around her ribs like a tightening rope. But now she felt something deeper pushing her forward. The silent urging from the journal's pages, the echo of those before her who hadn't made it out. A sudden noise, the distant crack of a door slamming, cut through the morning fog. Amelia's heart lurched. She forced her legs to move faster, stumbling over roots and rocks. Then, between two gnarled trees, she saw a narrow clearing where the ground dipped sharply. The trail forked there, one path curling down toward a dark gully, the other winding up toward the pale glow of the rising sun beyond the ridge. She hesitated, her chest heaving, eyes flicking between the two paths. From the gully came a faint sound, a shuffle too heavy to be an animal. Her pulse slammed in her ears. She turned and scrambled up the rising trail, mud sucking at her shoes. Behind her, a figure burst into the clearing. She dared a glance over her shoulder. The innkeeper. His long coat swung like a black blade, and even at this distance, she saw the cold fury in his face. A strangled cry tore from her throat. She pushed forward, her feet slipping. The journal banged against her ribs. The knife nearly fell from her grasp. The innkeeper's footsteps crashed after her, closer now, tearing through branches. She could hear his ragged breathing, the snapping of branches under his boots. Near the top of the rise, she stumbled and fell hard onto her side, her face smashing into wet leaves. She tasted blood. She forced herself up, clawing at the earth. Her fingers closed around the knife, slick with mud and sweat. The footsteps were almost upon her. She turned sharply, raising the blade with both hands as the innkeeper lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab her. Their eyes met in that instant, hers wide and terrified, his dark with murderous certainty. With a hoarse scream, Amelia swung the knife upward. The blade plunged into his side, shallow but enough to halt his charge. A roar of pain burst from his mouth. He staggered back, clutching his coat. Amelia scrambled away, her limbs burning, and sprinted up the last few feet of the trail. As she reached the crest, the first full light of morning spilled over her face, sharp and brilliant. She didn't look back. She ran forward, the forest opening before her in a blur of color and sound, her mind filled with one word, repeated again and again. Run. Amelia stumbled forward, her breath tearing from her in ragged gasps. Each step felt like it might be her last. Her knees buckled under her, her palms slick with mud and blood. Behind her, the sounds of the innkeeper's pursuit faded into the forest. She didn't know if he had fallen, if he still followed, or if he was waiting somewhere ahead. But she knew she couldn't stop. The forest swallowed her completely now, Tall pines closed in above, their branches weaving a dim, trembling ceiling of shadows and cold morning light. The ground sloped sharply, forcing her into a half-run, half-slide down the leaf-strewn path. She clutched the journal tight against her ribs. The knife, now sticky with blood and earth, was still in her hand, though her fingers had gone numb around its handle. Her foot snagged on a root, and she crashed forward, sliding down a small embankment. She landed hard in a patch of wet ferns, the breath knocked from her chest. For a long moment she lay still, the forest spinning above her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, louder than any voice she had heard in the inn. Slowly she forced herself up onto her elbows. Her hair hung in clumps around her face, her dress torn and soaked. She listened, and for the first time since stepping beyond the gate, she heard nothing. No heavy boots, no harsh breath. Just the quiet drip of morning dew from the leaves and the distant lonely call of a bird. Amelia crawled to her knees, then stood swaying as she caught her balance. She looked down at the knife in her hand, her fingers trembling violently now that the immediate danger had passed. She dropped it into the ferns, watching it vanish beneath the dark green. Her eyes turned upward, to a thin seam of pale sky beyond the trees. Somewhere beyond that ridge there might be a village, a road, or even just an open field. Anything but locked doors and silent rules. She pressed a bloodied hand to her chest, feeling the drum of her heart against her palm. With slow, deliberate steps she began to move again, each footfall softer and more careful. She didn't run now. She walked, her eyes open to every sound, every shift in the wind. As the light grew brighter, Amelia felt a fragile, almost painful warmth rising inside her. She had broken free, but at a cost she couldn't yet measure. She moved forward, leaving behind the blade, the grave, and the haunted inn that had swallowed so many voices before her. In the growing hush of the forest, she became something new. Not a captive, not a servant, but a survivor. Her own story still unwritten, echoing softly in her trembling steps. Amelia pushed through the undergrowth, each step slower now, her body shaking with exhaustion and cold. The pale morning light pressed through the high pines in narrow beams, catching in her tangled hair and on the blood smudged across her face and arms. She paused by a moss-covered rock, her breath heaving. Her fingers fumbled at her apron, pulling out the journal. Its pages were damp and bent, the ink blurred where her sweat and tears had soaked through. She flipped it open and traced the last page with trembling fingers, the rough sketch of the trail, the urgent lines that had guided her this far. She pressed it to her chest, closing her eyes. Images flooded her mind. The silent housemaid's wide, terrified eyes, the gardener's trembling hands, the grave in the backyard. She felt them all pressing at the edges of her memory, each one an echo of lives trapped and swallowed by the inn. Amelia opened her eyes and looked up through the branches. Somewhere beyond the forest, she knew, was a place where no one knew her name, where no one would watch her every breath or burn her words to ash. She drew in a shaky breath, trying to imagine what that freedom might feel like. Warm food, a door that stayed unlocked, sunlight on her skin without someone's gaze crawling across her back. A sudden crack in the brush startled her. She turned sharply, heart hammering, but saw only a deer slipping between the trees, its brown body disappearing into the fog. Her body sagged in relief. She realized then how tightly she'd been holding the journal, her knuckles white. Slowly she lowered it, cradling it as if it were a small wounded bird. She looked down at her hands, cut, bruised, smeared with dirt and blood, and felt a sudden surge of gratitude that they were still hers. Amelia took another step forward, her movements careful, reverent. She was still deep in the forest, the way ahead uncertain, but she felt a fragile certainty blooming inside her. She was moving away from the inn, away from its silent halls and locked doors. For the first time since she arrived at that cursed place, she was no longer moving under someone else's orders. She stepped forward again, her breath rising like small prayers into the cold morning air. In her hands, the journal felt lighter now, no longer a record of past despair, but a fragile, flickering map toward something she might one day call her own life. Amelia moved slowly now, her steps heavy and deliberate. Each time she placed her foot down, she felt the ground as if learning to walk again, testing her balance on the soft moss over roots slick with morning dew. The forest around her had begun to thin, the trees spaced wider apart, the fog lifting in slow, delicate ribbons. Small shafts of sunlight broke through, lighting patches of ferns and damp stones like little beacons. She paused by a shallow brook, the water whispering softly over smooth rocks. She knelt, dipping her hands into the icy current. The shock of cold jolted her fully awake, clearing some of the fog in her mind. She scooped water into her mouth, the taste sharp and clean. Droplets slid down her chin and onto her dress, washing away a thin layer of blood and grime. She sat back on her heels, shivering. With trembling fingers, she opened the journal again, turning its crumpled pages. Her eyes traced the frantic, slanted handwriting, the last desperate words of the girl who had hidden it. "If you find this, run, beyond the grave, beyond the trees, don't stop." Amelia's lips parted, her breath turning the words into a hushed echo against the forest hush. She closed the journal and held it against her chest, her forehead resting on its worn cover. A sob rose, catching in her throat, not only for herself but for every girl whose name would never be spoken again. When she lifted her head, her eyes were clearer. She scanned the path ahead, a gentle slope leading toward a patch of sky so bright it made her squint. She stood, swaying slightly. Her fingers squeezed the journal one last time before slipping it into her apron. She took a step forward, then another, her feet carrying her toward the light, toward the unknown beyond the forest's last edge. Every breath felt like stitching a new seam, delicate and unfinished, but her own. Each heartbeat thudded with a quiet promise. She was alive. She had chosen this direction. And even though the weight of what she carried would remain, the scars, the ghosts, the memories of rooms that smelled of ash and damp wood, Amelia felt the shape of something new inside her, fragile as a new leaf, the beginning of freedom. She pressed on, the forest parting ahead of her like a slowly opening door. Amelia stepped out of the tree line and into an open clearing just as the sun pushed above the distant ridge. Light spilled across the meadow in pale gold waves, catching on the dew and turning each blade of grass into a small shard of glass. She shielded her eyes with one hand, blinking into the brightness. For a moment she stood frozen, as if the world beyond the forest were too large, too loud to enter. Her dress hung in torn, muddy ribbons around her legs, her arms striped with scratches and purple bruises. Her hair, tangled and heavy with sweat, clung to her cheeks, but her eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected a fierce, stunned clarity. She took a tentative step into the clearing, feeling the soft give of wet grass under her bare feet. The scent of pine and morning mist gave way to wildflowers and warm earth. She breathed in deeply, the air burning her lungs in the sweetest way. Amelia turned once to look back at the forest. Its edge loomed dark and silent, each tree like a watchful figure she had finally outrun. She felt a tremor run through her shoulders, a quiet shiver of grief and release. She thought of the innkeeper's pale, furious face, the smoldering parchment in his hands, the maid's terrified eyes. She thought of the grave behind the inn and the journal hidden under the floorboards. All the pieces of other lives stitched into her escape. Then she faced forward again, her lips parting as though to say something, but no sound came. Instead, her breath left her in a long, unsteady exhale, as if she were finally letting go of something knotted tight inside her chest. She took another step, and then another. Each footfall was a fragile, defiant promise. Forward, forward, forward. As she moved through the tall grass, the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth across her face and shoulders. Her body ached, but beneath the pain was a sharp, undeniable current of life, raw and electric. She did not know where the meadow ended, what roads lay beyond, or who, if anyone, might find her. But each uncertain step felt like a quiet victory, a single stitch in the new seam she was learning to sew. With the journal pressed to her side, Amelia crossed the clearing alone, carrying nothing but her wounds, her breath, and the fragile glow of a dawn she had claimed for herself. At the far edge of the meadow, Amelia slowed her steps. The rising sun painted her path in gentle warmth, gilding her torn dress and catching in the strands of her tangled hair. She felt each ray seep into her skin, into the deep, hollow places left behind by the inn. She turned once more to look back. From this distance, the forest appeared almost peaceful, a dark wall of pine and mist, holding all its secrets close. But Amelia knew what lay inside: the silent halls, the cold eyes, the grave. A wind moved across the clearing, lifting the edge of her skirt and carrying the faint smell of earth and pine. She closed her eyes and let it wrap around her, a final echo of the world she had escaped. When she opened them again, she felt as though her vision had sharpened. The distant line of hills, the shimmer of a thin stream winding through the valley below, and far off, a faint trail that might lead to a village or a road. She pressed a hand to her ribs, feeling the soft, worn edges of the journal beneath her apron. It was no longer just a record of despair. It was proof of survival, the thread tying her to every girl who had dared to imagine freedom. Her body ached with each breath, her cuts and bruises burning in the morning air. But the pain felt honest, hers alone, no longer a punishment forced upon her. She took another step forward, her foot sinking into the damp grass, then another. Each movement felt like a declaration. I am here. I am still moving. A few birds lifted from the grass ahead, their wings flashing white and gray as they disappeared into the brightening sky. Amelia watched them go, her eyes softening with something like wonder. She drew in a long, slow breath. The air tasted sharp and green, as though the world had been newly washed. With her final glance at the forest behind her, she turned fully toward the valley. The light spilled across her face, revealing every bruise, every tear track, every line of exhaustion, and beyond all of it, a fragile, fierce spark of life. Amelia began to walk down the slope, her steps unsteady but resolute. Each step stitched her farther away from the silence that had bound her, and closer to a future she would shape herself, uneven, unknown, but hers. By the time the sun rose fully over the ridge, Amelia had disappeared into the valley below, leaving behind the echo of a captive girl and carrying forward only the quiet, unwavering beat of her own heart.